And this is Monday, and I just wanted to take a minute and just say, wow, what a great day yesterday. A total experiment, and we weren't even sure how to set parking up or the getting the FM to go through like it did. And what a great day, and what a wonderful, just the whole thing. People were great, stayed in their cars. The offering was great. The spirit was great. Amens. For you that weren't there, we had horn honking for amen, or some people brought amen on a paper and put it up to their windshield or waved it out the window. But what a great day, and a wonderful crowd. And I don't know how many people, of course. I don't know if we had visitors, and a little awkward, but thanks for a great day. And praise the Lord for his goodness and his provision. And we had a man come Sunday who'd gotten saved just recently, came to church for the first time, came to get baptized. How about that? And I said, right now it might be good we wait a week or two. He said, I got God now anyway. It's all just fine. We'll wait a week or two. Boy, God's sure good. Thank the Lord for his kindness. Thank you, Faith Baptist Church, for your faithfulness. What a privilege to be a part of this great time, and a time to minister and encourage people. And again, thanks so much for all you do. Good evening. I'm glad to get another evening together with you, and I hope these evenings are a blessing. It's always good for me to study and to review things that I've learned and taught over the years, and I hope this is a help. I was just taking some time to pray before the video turned on, to pray for our church members and for people across our country, that we would grow in strength and wisdom, knowledge and understanding. I hope we'll grow in grit and tenacity as we look at these stories, especially tonight, these stories of the steps to freedom. How did we get from a European and British bondage, where literally the people in every community were subject to illegal search and seizure? That's where our laws came from in America, because they were subject to that. Laws of land ownership, the idea that the government could not establish or create a one government church. Had nothing to do with the church and the government not being intertwined, or with religion not being a part of church. You go back to the early days of our country, they had church in the Capitol building, and it was religion was a very active part of our political roots. And this ridiculous idea that the government and government documents and taxpayer-funded events can't have prayer. That is such an abuse of our founders' ideals. When they said that, I talked about the free exercise of religion and the government not establishing, it didn't mean that the White House couldn't have a nativity scene in their front lawn. It meant the White House couldn't say, you in California, you have to be Presbyterian, and you in Arizona, you have to be Methodist, and you in Maryland have to be Catholics. That's what our founders were talking about. And any of these people who read our history and studied our founders' writings know that stuff. They're abusing it, like happens so often. Power-hungry, anti-God, anti-religious people. And we as the people of God have a heritage of folks who stood up and said, hey, we're not going to do it this way. We're going to do it God's way, and you can like it or lump it. I want to encourage people to get a little grit, a little fight in their soul, to stand up for something. It's a little bit scary when the city of New York is told you can't have drinks over 20 ounces or 30 or whatever, it doesn't matter what. When a governor makes a rule like that, I think every restaurant in town should have started serving 64-ounce drinks, and that was the only size cup they had in the whole city. No governor's got a right to do that. No mayor, no president's got a right to do that. There's no constitutional right for our government to tell us how to live. And we need to be very careful. We need a little fight in us. It ought to, when a government steps in and tells us how to live, what to do and not to do, immediately there ought to be some bristle in us. And we may decide, okay, I guess we do need driver's licenses. But right off the bat, it ought to bother us, excuse me, just a little bit. Government says you have to have a fishing license. I'm for it. I think our fishing license fees may go into fishing game and restocking and all that. I've never fished without a fishing license, but you know what? Right away, right off when you hear about it, it ought to bother you just a little bit. And the reason it ought to bother us is because we have this passive culture, and if we fail to be willing to stand up for anything, we are going to be overrun by corruption. It's just that testing of the waters and that little slipping in of corruption. So we've been talking about these steps from 1600s when people were so oppressed by government and religion. And again, government and religion were tied. They were hand in hand. They were married. Some people use the illustration. And if you were living under their area, geographic area of influence, you had to do what they said. And the atrocities committed in the name of religion. And we're not just talking about the Catholics and an Inquisition and Muslims. And we're talking about Presbyterians and Methodists and Anglicans and Lutherans, and especially the Reformers, Martin Luther and Zwingli and John Calvin. And you can look all over my libraries, and I don't believe you'll find anything John Calvin wrote. Now, my computer, there's bound to be some stuff that slipped in through whatever programs and all, but man, I don't want to learn from a guy who murdered people because they disagreed with him. That's Islam, and that's satanic, and that certainly is not Bible-believing Christianity. And so we went from this dissenter, this man sitting in a jail cell in the early 1600s, and we followed through to Roger Williams coming to America, realizing he did not fit with that Anglican church anymore, works his way out into the wilderness over to what is now Rhode Island. And John Clark, the Baptist, joins up with him, and these are good men, knew their Bibles, and Roger Williams was maybe for a little while called himself a Baptist. He was not. He didn't remain a Baptist, but they were okay working together because Baptists believe in freedom, and it's okay for you to believe what you believe. And the first Baptist church in America built there in Rhode Island, the first Catholic church in Rhode Island, the first Jewish synagogue. Why? In all of the country, the first Baptist and Catholic and Jewish place of worship. Why was it there? Because 12 years was spent going back and forth to England, and these good men that came there, Roger Williams and John Clark, were so very key in getting religious liberty. They got the Rhode Island Charter, the first thing in the history of the world, as far as we know, where people could think freely. And today, we take it so much for granted. And if I don't want onions on my hamburger, I shouldn't have to have it. Remember, you that are my age, remember years ago, maybe in the 70s, Burger King had the ad, "Have it your way," because prior to that, you went to McDonald's, got a burger, you got what they served. You went to Burger King, you got what they served. And Burger King came up with this idea: we will custom make your burger. You want no ketchup, we'll have no ketchup. You want no onions, we'll do it. And that was the big commercial for a long time. Well, now everybody does it. And we forget that there was a time when you just ate the burger you got. And we get so used to freedom, and we get so used to having things comfortable, that we forget that it wasn't always that way. And as Christians, I could start a religion, the Goddardites, and we could go out and buy a piece of land, and I could go around inviting people to come to the Goddardite church. And I could do it freely. I could incorporate it. I could run it as an unincorporated association. All different ways I could run it. I could take offerings. We could be nonprofit. And it's nobody's business what kind of religion. I don't know what I'd do. You know what I'd be? I'd be an independent, Bible-believing, soul-winning Baptist, but I'd be. I'm not only thankful for my roots, I love them, I believe in them, and with all my heart. I'm not a Baptist because of my background. I'm a Baptist because of my Bible and because of history and looking what the Scriptures have said. And if you've not studied the Scriptures, don't get critical of those comments, because I might have been critical of those comments 40 years ago, but now that I've taken time to do my homework, I believe that way. So we go from Roger Williams and John Clark, and they had that church, and freedom began creeping into the hearts and minds of people, and especially these Baptists, but Quakers as well, and others. Pennsylvania was an awful lot of Quakers there from Penn, and little by little, little seeds of liberty, religious liberty, freedom of conscience creeping in. We talked about the visit of John Clark and his men going up to Lynn, Massachusetts, and up there the beating of Obadiah Holmes simply for opening a Bible in a home of a man who used to be a member of their church down in Rhode Island. And because the three men went there to have a small private in-home Bible study, a service of some kind, there he was beaten. And what a tragedy, what an abuse of the powers that were over that city, over that community there in Lynn, Massachusetts. And but there was Henry Dunster. And again, I'm summarizing quickly. Henry Dunster, the first president official. Before this, there was a little bit of time that someone was at Harvard, but it folded. Henry Dunster resurrected Harvard, first president, got the land, a house for the president, writing his own expense and time and abilities, a printing press, began printing things. He was very successful, a very, very intelligent man. And he watched that and listened to Obadiah Holmes as this Baptist was being whipped. He listened to him preaching and quoting scripture. He went home, studied, decided he couldn't agree with infant baptism. Baptism was for believers only. And he began explaining that and teaching that. And he wouldn't let his baby get baptized. He loses his job. And there's a lot of tragedy. A lot of people paid for what you and I take for granted today. What I have today to sit here with two Bibles on my desk and say what I believe, this cost a lot. We talk about freedom isn't free, and usually we go back to soldiers and firearms, and I believe that completely. But it went back to some Baptists and some other Bible-believing people who they shed their blood, and they did not fight back, and they just said, this is who we are. You read the story, and you can find them. They're all over. The story of imprisoned preachers in Virginia especially, and great stories. One pastor was thrown in prison, and so he's preaching through the cell, the bars. There's a window going to the outside. His people would just gather around the jail, and he'd be preaching to them, having his hands out, waving his hands. Well, the magistrate had come along with a whip or a stick and began beating his hands, and his hands were just bleeding to get his hands back in. And they did all kinds of horrible things to these men that they imprisoned. At one point, they were so tired of this one man's preaching, they built a wall up so no one could see in the window. And so his people would come on the other side of the wall, and they'd wave a cloth or something over the wall to let him know they're there, and he'd preach still, and people would come, and it infuriated these people who didn't want these Baptists around. And story after story, one Baptist in jail, and they said, we're going to fix him. They put him in a jail cell with the meanest, ugliest guy there was, and a guy who was fighting and cussing and just a horrible guy. Well, in those days, if you had any clothes or blankets or anything decent to eat, people brought it to you. Well, this preacher's in there, and his church members are bringing all kinds of good things. And he's sharing them with this guy. And suddenly this guy's eating better than he'd been eating. And he's wearing warmer clothes. He's got a blanket. He shared that this preacher shared with him. And little by little, a guy called Cussin' Jack Waller, Swearing Jack Waller, he gets saved. And the preacher's preaching out the window, and somebody comes trying to grab the preacher's hands and hurt him. And this old rough guy that got saved in jail grabbed the man, smashed his head into the bars, and just held him there and said, you go ahead and preach, preacher. I'll hang on to this guy. And he became his great friend, best friend later on. Cussin' Jack, Swearing Jack Waller, he became a preacher and a fiery preacher. He got beat up for his faith. And those days ought to be in front of every young person in school. And by the way, these lessons are in front of the kids in our school. And we want our young people to know American history and that where did freedom come from and who paid for you to have the right to ride that bicycle. That's why when they made a law you have to wear a bicycle helmet, it just bothered me. Now, I'm not against bicycle helmets. I'm against them telling me I have to wear a bicycle helmet. And it ought to just a little grit. If you really want to make laws to keep people safe, we ought to stop abortion. We ought to make people eat better. We ought to make them take vitamins, make sure everybody does an exercise routine every day. We all know those things are good for us. We don't make laws. We ought to outlaw liquor. We ought to outlaw tobacco, but we don't under the auspices of freedom. We believe in freedom. Well, you know what? If we believe in freedom, then let's believe in freedom. I ain't wearing a bicycle helmet. Now, my kids did, because we're going to keep the law. Up through 16 or whatever the age was, I told my kids we're going to honor the law. And as soon as you get over that age, you don't. If they make a law, adults have to wear a helmet, I'm selling my bicycle. And just because I don't like people telling me what to do, especially when it's none of their business. And you might think that's a bad attitude. That bad attitude got us this country. And that bad attitude, and I don't call it a bad attitude, I call it independence. I call it a passion for freedom. And I want my next door neighbor to have freedom. And I want the church down the street to have freedom. And there are people that have said things they shouldn't say, lied about things that they had no business saying. And you know what? In America, you have a freedom to voice, you have a freedom of speech. And I would protect the right of someone to slander me, because I believe in freedom. And they'll face God for their words. Jesus said that they'll give an account of every idle word. I don't have to worry about people hating Christianity or hating our church or hating you. Don't fret on that. God's going to take care of them. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant, Paul wrote. To his own master he'll stand or fall. God will take care of things. Now, the story goes on. The church movement going on, and I'm just going to skip for the sake of time because I get rambling, but we get up to the days of the Constitution, and they're putting the Constitution together, trying to ratify the Constitution, and we have John Leland, this leader of the Baptist churches, and James Madison, and Madison and Leland are there. Madison's trying to get Leland to get the Baptists to join him. They needed the Baptists to ratify from this area to ratify the Constitution. And again, a great story, longer than I'll tell. But the bottom line was Leland said, no, we're not going to join you. And Leland was considering going on his own to represent that area. And the issue was, he said to Madison, we need a guarantee of liberty. We need something to guarantee religious liberty. And we don't believe you're going to give it to us. Well, the discussion went on, and Madison, through a lengthy conversation, they made an agreement. Madison committed, said, I will make sure there is a commitment, an amendment, a guarantee, a Bill of Rights. And the number one thing he put, and he kept his word, and we got the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights. Number one, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the free exercise of our religion. Not just that I can believe what I want, but I can practice that religion as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. And I don't know, but my religion says kill everybody. We got other laws that are going to take care of that. But the freedom of the press, freedom to peacefully assemble, all these things, our First Amendment, our Second Amendment, the freedom to bear arms, those things, to bear arms, not keep them locked up in separate safes. And in Australia they've got a law. Most of the guns have been confiscated, but you can have your gun in this safe, your ammo in this safe, and we're going to come by and check and make sure they're locked up separately. You have to be a member of a gun club. That's not freedom. That's tyranny. And we were given some rights, but see, it came from some Baptists who said, no, we won't. There was an edict of tolerance that came to the colonies when they were trying to suppress the Quakers and the Baptists and other dissenters and atheists. People just didn't want any religion. And they said, all right, we'll tolerate your religion. You can be a Lutheran, you can be a Presbyterian, you can be a Methodist. We have an edict of tolerance, sign the thing, and we're going to give you permission to be you. And they came to the Baptists. The Baptists said, you aren't going to tolerate us. We're going to do what we're doing whether you like it or not. And they were not going to be tolerated. They were going to be free men. Because if you have a right to give me you will tolerate me, then you have a right to say you're not going to tolerate me. And as you'll see in a moment here, that's not the way Bible-believing Baptists believe. It's not the way Bible-believing people believe. And so we have our Bill of Rights, we have our Constitution, we have the changing of a whole culture of people. And again, you can look back and slander our founders, and there were slaves and there was injustices. No one in the history of the world had done what they were doing. This was when the Rhode Island Charter was granted by the king. It was a lively experiment. Nobody knew it. It had never been done before. And like Benjamin Franklin trying to figure out electricity, you can go ahead and criticize what a mess he was. He was figuring it out for the first time. And our founders were figuring out for the first time what liberty meant. They were figuring out what it meant that all men were created equal. They were figuring out what it meant that you and I have rights and no government can tell us what to do. And when you're inventing a whole civilization, a whole philosophy of life for the first time, folks, you're going to make some mistakes. And all the decisions aren't going to be made right. But I know this, going back to pre-colonial days is not going to fix anything. It'll give us nothing but tyranny and then anarchy and lawlessness, because we're not going to put up with it. You take away our internet, and our millennials are going to go crazy. They're going to start tearing up buildings. And we have a culture that we don't realize the price tag. Now, we go to John Bunyan, and here we are about 1660. So we're some years into this scenario I had, from the dissenter in prison to Roger Williams and John Clark and the founding of Rhode Island. But this is in that era. And I'm just going to do this. Bunyan, this is his trial. And how this was found is an interesting story. I won't tell you, but many hundreds of years later, the actual transcript from this trial was found. These Protestants were good at documenting everything. And most of the history of the Baptists that we have, we got from the writings of the people who burned us at the stake, buried us alive, and put people on the rack and stretched them and tortured them, because they kept records. They were sadistic people. They wrote down what they said, what we said, what they said, what we said. And that's what we're going to look at here this evening. And we're going to look at the Bible just quickly. So I'm going to just read you. This is, picture John Bunyan, a tinker, a common craftsman who's been preaching to small groups, a Baptist man. He got saved later in life. His wife led him to Christ. And we have Judge Wingate. And he's got a courtroom, and he's got multiple things to do that day. Next case, John Bunyan. So that's where we're coming in. I'm just going to read it, and I'll explain that all the dialogue is between John Bunyan and Judge Wingate, the Baptist preacher who's been arrested, and Judge Wingate. There's one word here, the Conventicle Act. And the Conventicle Act basically said that in England, you could not hold church services on your own, and you had to go to the services of the Church of England. That was an act or a law or a rule or an edict. The Conventicle Act is, you can't go out and hold a Baptist service. You will be an Anglican, and that's all you can be. And if you go out and preach anything else, we're going to throw you in jail. And the king, there was more and more dissenters coming along. So this was the era when the king started granting licenses. And all right, we'll give you a license if you only preach, if you don't cause a lot of grief and don't make a lot of noise, we'll let you have your little, but it was very minimal, and it was a license granted by the government. And so let me just read this to you. And I just love this. I've read it over and over. I've had our young men in my speaking class read it and reenact the trial. And this is the kind of character that made the Baptist church from the time of the apostles, from John the Baptist, who preached against the man Herod marrying his brother's wife, and they got his head chopped off. This is the kind of spirit that Christ had, that said when interrogated, he said, "Don't you know I have power to crucify you or to set you free?" And Jesus said, "You have no power at all except it was given you from above. You don't have any power over me." That kind of Christ-like assurance that we know what's right. Now follow me, and just let me read this very short thing, but you'll enjoy it. John Bunyan. So he's in the this is October 3rd, 1660. He eventually is imprisoned after this dialogue. Judge Wingate. Mr. Bunyan, you stand before this court accused of persistent and willful transgression of the Conventicle Act, which prohibits all British citizens or all British subjects from abstaining themselves from worship in the Church of England and from conducting worship services apart from our church. You come, presumably, with no legal training and yet without counsel. I must warn you, sir, of the gravity of the charge, the harshness of the penalty in the event of your conviction, and the foolhardiness of acting as your own counsel in so serious a matter. I hold in my hand the depositions of witnesses against you. In each case, they have testified that to their knowledge, you have never in your adult life attended services in the church of this parish. Each further testifies that he has observed you on numerous occasions conducting religious exercises in and near Bedford. John Bunyan. The depositions speak truth. I have never attended the church or the services in the Church of England, nor do I intend ever to do so. Isn't that a sweet spirit? Secondly, it's no secret that I preach the word of God whenever, wherever, and to whomsoever he pleases to grant me opportunity to do so. I have no choice but to acknowledge my awareness of the law which I am accused of transgressing. Likewise, I have no choice but to confess my guilt in transgressing it. As true as these things are, I must affirm that I neither regret breaking the law nor repent of having broken it. Further, I must warn you, here's the guy being charged, warning the judge. Further, I must warn you that I have no intention in the future of conforming to it. Judge Wingate, it's obvious, sir. It's obvious, sir, that you are a victim of deranged thinking. If my ears deceive me not, I must infer from your words that you believe the state to have no interest in the religious life of its subjects. The state, my lord, said Bunyan, may have an interest in anything it wishes to have an interest, but the state has no right whatsoever to interfere in the religious life of its citizens. Judge Wingate, the evidence I hold in my hand, even apart from your own admission of guilt, is sufficient to convict you, and the court is within its rights to have you committed to prison for a considerably long time. I do not wish to send you to prison, Mr. Bunyan. I'm aware of the poverty of your family. I believe you have a little daughter who unfortunately was born blind. Is this not so? It is, my lord. Very well, Judge Wingate continued. The decision of the court is this. Inasmuch as the accused has confessed his guilt, we shall follow a merciful and compassionate course of action. We shall release him on the condition that he swears solemnly to discontinue the convening of religious meetings, and that he affix his signature to such an oath prior to quitting the courtroom. That will be all, Mr. Bunyan. We hope not to see you here again. May we hear the next case. My lord, says Mr. Bunyan, if I may have another moment of the court's time. Judge Wingate, yes, but you must be quick about it. We have other matters to attend to. What is it? John Bunyan, I cannot do what you ask, my lord. I cannot place my signature upon a document in which I promise henceforth not to preach. My calling to preach the gospel is from God, and he alone can make me discontinue what he has appointed me to do. As I have had no word from him to that effect, I must continue to preach, and I shall continue to preach. You ever wonder about the president and people in our country who just happen to say what they think, and how that fries people who've got their figuratively long wigs and their high and lofty offices? They've forgotten they're not lords. Judge Wingate, I warn you, sir, the court has gone the second mile to be lenient with you out of concern for your family's difficult straits. Truth to tell, it would appear that the court's concern for your family exceeds your own. Do you wish to go to prison? No, my lord, said Bunyan. Few things there are that I would wish less. Judge Wingate, very well then, Mr. Bunyan. This court will make one further attempt in good faith to accommodate what appears to be strongly held convictions on your part. In his compassion and benevolence, our sovereign, Charles II, has made provision for dissenting preachers to hold some limited meetings. All that is required is that such a minister procure licenses authorizing them to convene these gatherings. You'll not find the procedure burdensome, even to you, Mr. Bunyan. Must surely grant the legitimacy of the state's interest in ensuring that any fool with a Bible does not simply gather a group of people together and begin to preach to them. Imagine the implications if that were to happen. Can you comply with this condition, Mr. Bunyan? And you can imagine the response, right? Before you answer, the judge continues, mark this. Should you refuse, the court will have no alternative but to sentence you to a prison term. Think you, sir, of your poor wife. Think of your children, and particularly your pitiful, sightless little girl. Think of your flock, who can hear you to their heart's content when you have secured your licenses. Think on these things and give us your answer, sir. John Bunyan, my lord, I appreciate the court's effort to be, as you put it, accommodating. But again, I must refuse your terms. I must repeat that it is God who constrains me to preach, and no man or company of men may grant or deny me leave to preach. These licenses of which you speak, my lord, are symbols not of a right, but of a privilege. Implied therein is the principle that a mere man can extend or withhold them according to his whim. I speak not of privileges, but of rights.
Privileges or licenses granted by men may be denied. Rights are granted by God and can be legitimately denied by no man. I must therefore refuse to comply. Very well, Mr. Bunyan, said Judge Wingate. Since you persist in your intractability, and since you reject this court's honest effort at compromise, you leave us no choice but to commit you to Bedford jail for a period of 6 years. It eventually became 12 and a half years. If you manage to survive, I think that your experience will correct your thinking. If you fail to survive, that will be unfortunate. In any event, I strongly suspect that we have heard the last we shall ever hear from Mr. Bunyan. Now, may we hear the next case. Of course, Judge Wingate and the world heard much from John Bunyan. And in that jail cell, John Bunyan wrote on, he was denied paper and pen, but he had his Bible. And on little stoppers of paper that were stuffed in the milk bottles with charcoal from his own fire, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, the second greatest selling book in the history of the world. Before John Bunyan was in prison, see how God makes all things work together for good. And no one wants to go through what John Bunyan went through. But before he went to prison, he preached to very small crowds, just a handful here and there. It was literally illegal to be a Baptist or go to a Baptist meeting. And so there were small groups. By the time he got out of prison 12 years later, his book had been translated in multiple languages. People had read it everywhere. When he came out, the crowds would be so large he couldn't walk through them to get up to a raised platform to preach. They literally, on one occasion, held him over their heads and passed him man to man up to the platform so he could be on this raised platform and preach to the people. His time in prison did nothing but lift up the name of Christ and lift up the preaching of the free exercise of religion. This is in 1660. This is the kind of thing that gave us our faith. But it's not just John Bunyan. We're not just saying we want this kind of spirit from him. But let me just read you a verse quickly from Daniel in chapter 3. The king says to Daniel's friends, "Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, if he doesn't deliver us, if we burn, be it known unto thee, O king, we will not serve your gods." That is a Bible set of Bible principles of life. You're not going to run my religion. And if I die, I will die faithful to God. And you go over to the book of Acts, and you find in Acts chapter 4, they've been preaching, they've been arrested, they've been told not to preach again. And in Acts chapter 4, I bring you into the conversation of Peter and John with those who had arrested them. And Peter and John answered, in Acts chapter 4, verse 19. "And Peter and John answered and said unto them, Whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye." You judge. Should we listen to you more than God? "For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard." The apostles, most of them, gave their lives for their faith. And from that day of the apostles, traveling through the early days of the church, up through the dark ages, dark because the Catholic Church had basically outlawed the Bible, and there was this underground group of people that had pieces of Bibles and scriptures. There was no fully assembled Bible yet. That group of people that kept the gospel alive, many of them, some say as many as 50 million, were murdered for this book and for the faith that it's kind of rainy today, I don't think I'll go to church. For a Bible that sits on our shelf and we fail to read it. We'll watch a 3-hour ball game and we give 3 minutes to Bible reading. Folks, your faith is precious. My faith is precious. And the freedom that we enjoy in America today, it was purchased by people who passionately believe this book. Yes, the soldiers and the military in every war from today all the way back to the Revolutionary War, we owe them. But our freedom probably was born by a group of unknown people in a prison in the early 1600s when they just pled, could I just have free exercise. Free exercise of my faith. That's in our documents 160 years later. Could I just have a right to believe what I believe? And they were willing to sit in jail rather than surrender their faith. Roger Williams. And the story goes on all the way up to John Leland and James Madison. And I mentioned the night when I addressed the story in more detail, but if you didn't hear that lesson, today you can go to the Leland Madison Park, and it was named after the Baptist preacher first. A monument is there still. Google it on your, it's cheaper to just Google it and put images on your computer. And you Google the Leland Madison Park and hit images, and you'll see that monument there to the Baptist preacher. And you got to be careful who you're reading, because they'll do their best to take the word Baptist out, to take the word preacher out, and they'll try to blur us all into this warm and fuzzy thing. We're not. These people, we're not going to bow. And I hope we get a little grit inside us. And we want to be loving, we want to be kind, but we ought not bow to our faith. God bless you. Hey, tomorrow we're starting some new lessons, and we got, as long as we're on isolation, let's talk. You want me to address a certain subject? I might do some Q&A. If you want to text a question, if I know the answer, somebody sent me a question the other day, and I thought, man, I don't know the answer either. And I'm not brilliant. I do love what I do, and I love my book, and I love my God and my country. But let's be faithful to God. Would you do that? Let's be good to one another. A lot of people struggling these days. And let's share. Let's share. I heard it, just close with a quick story. I heard somebody in the news say, if the government sends me a check, he said, I've got a job. My paycheck hasn't changed. I don't deserve that money. Don't need that money. He said, I'm going to send it to the Trump reelection campaign. And my wife said, I think we ought to be sending that money. If we don't need it, if we still got our job, we ought to be sending it to support the church, who's been basically closed by crooked edicts, or whatever we want to call it, by the concern of our government. And man, we got a great right, great privileges, great liberties in America. Let's love our country. Let's love the founding of our country. Let's raise our children to be loving of freedom and loving the God who grants freedom. God bless you. Have a great night.